The custody fight didn't end with a gavel strike or a clear answer. It ended with silence, distance, and a long stretch of unanswered questions. What came next for Timmy wasn't a resolution. It was a pause that felt heavier than any decision. Everything around him changed, but no one could clearly say what his future was supposed to look like. For years, Timmy's world had been small, familiar, and repetitive. The same land, the same people, the same routines. Even when things were chaotic or difficult, they were predictable. That predictability mattered more than anyone on the outside seemed to understand. Stability wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about recognition, knowing who would be there when you woke up, knowing whose voice belonged to which footsteps, knowing where you fit. When custody entered the picture, that sense of place fractured. What followed wasn't just a legal process. It was a separation from everything Timmy understood as normal. Decisions were made in rooms he never entered. Conversations happened without his voice. Plans were formed around him, not with him. And in the middle of it all was a person who didn't have the words, tools, or authority to explain what he wanted or what he was losing. People argue about intent. They argue about who meant well and who didn't. But intent doesn't erase impact. And the impact was immediate. Timmy was removed from the environment that shaped him, without clarity about what came next or how long the separation would last. The aftermath didn't bring peace. It brought uncertainty. Months passed with no meaningful contact, no familiar voices, no reassurance that this was temporary, no clear explanation that made sense to him. From the outside, it may have looked like progress or protection. From the inside, it was disorientation. Timmy didn't just lose access to people. He lost continuity. And continuity is everything when your world is built on routine. There's a mistake people make when they talk about custody cases like this. They focus on outcomes instead of experience. They debate legality instead of humanity. They ask who won instead of asking what was lost. But Timmy's path forward can't be measured in court filings or custody labels. It has to be measured in emotional damage, adjustment, and long-term impact. Because removal alone doesn't guarantee safety. And placement alone doesn't guarantee healing. What happens after the cameras stop rolling is where the real story lives. Timmy's future now exists in a system that values compliance over comfort, schedules over familiarity, oversight over understanding. And while those systems exist for a reason, they often fail to account for people like Timmy, people whose needs don't fit neatly into checklists or timelines. There's also the issue no one wants to sit with. Timmy didn't ask for this fight. He didn't ask to be the center of attention. He didn't ask to become a symbol, a prize, or a problem to solve. Yet his life became all three. And once that happens, it's almost impossible to undo. People talk about what's best for him without fully grasping what best even means in this context. Is it structure? Is it supervision? Is it opportunity? Or is it familiarity, emotional safety, and connection? The answer isn't simple, and pretending it is does more harm than good. The most dangerous thing about the aftermath is the assumption that time alone will fix it. Time doesn't heal confusion unless it's paired with consistency. Time doesn't build trust unless it's paired with honesty. And time doesn't erase trauma unless it's met with care. Right now, Timmy's path forward is being shaped by decisions already made, and by decisions still hanging in limbo. The longer that limbo lasts, the harder it becomes to rebuild what was broken. Distance doesn't just separate people physically. It reshapes memory. It weakens attachment. It creates new normals that don't always feel safe. And the hardest part? Timmy has no control over any of it. He can't file motions. He can't advocate for himself. He can't explain what he feels in a way the system listens to. So others speak for him, sometimes too loudly, sometimes inaccurately, sometimes with their own interests tangled in the outcome. The custody battle may be over on paper, but the aftermath is far from settled. The real question isn't where Timmy is right now. It's where he's headed, and whether the path being built for him is one he can survive emotionally, not just legally. There's still a chance to do this right. There's still time to center his needs instead of narratives. But that requires honesty, accountability, and restraint from everyone involved. Because the truth is uncomfortable. You can follow every rule and still cause harm. You can win custody and still lose trust. You can remove someone for their own good and still leave lasting damage. Timmy's story isn't about villains and heroes. It's about consequences. It's about power. And it's about what happens when a vulnerable person becomes the focal point of a battle they never chose. This isn't the end of his story, but is a crossroads. And what happens next will matter more than anything that came before. If you've been following this situation, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Once the custody decision faded from public view, the reality of Timmy's situation became quieter, and in many ways, more troubling. Silence replaced updates. Distance replaced familiarity. And the absence of information became its own kind of answer. When systems close ranks, the people most affected are often the ones with the least ability to ask questions. Timmy's world no longer revolved around faces he recognized or routines he depended on. Instead, it revolved around schedules set by others, environments chosen without his input, and expectations he never agreed to. Even when intentions are framed as protective, the emotional cost of abrupt separation doesn't disappear just because paperwork says it's necessary. What's often misunderstood is how deeply identity is tied to environment. Timmy wasn't just living somewhere. He belonged somewhere. That sense of belonging didn't come from perfection. It came from repetition, familiarity, and emotional anchors. When those anchors are removed suddenly, the result isn't clarity. It's destabilization. And destabilization has consequences. People assume that placement in a structured setting automatically improves quality of life. But structure without connection can feel cold. Supervision without trust can feel threatening. Rules without explanation can feel like punishment. For someone like Timmy, whose understanding of the world is shaped more by emotion and routine than abstract reasoning, those shifts are profound. There's also the issue of voice or the lack of it. Timmy's preferences were rarely centered in discussions about his future. Adults debated what was best, but few asked what felt safest to him. And even if they did, there was an assumption that his answer might not count. That assumption alone reveals a systemic flaw. Being vulnerable does not mean being voiceless. Needing support does not mean forfeiting agency. Yet in practice, that's often exactly what happens. Another layer of complexity is the way narratives form after custody cases. Stories get simplified. Sides get chosen. People begin speaking with certainty about situations they only partially understand. And in that noise, Timmy becomes less of a person and more of an idea, someone to argue over, defend, or condemn. But Timmy isn't an argument. He's a human being navigating force change. The aftermath also exposed how fragile accountability can be. Once custody is determined, oversight tends to focus on compliance rather than well-being. Boxes get checked, reports get filed, but emotional health is harder to measure, so it's often sidelined. And when there's no visible crisis, there's an assumption that things are fine. Fine doesn't mean healthy. Quiet doesn't mean okay. Adjustment, especially under pressure, can look like compliance. Timmy may follow instructions. He may appear calm. He may not outwardly resist. But internal distress doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind silence. Sometimes it shows up months later in ways that are harder to trace back to their source. Another uncomfortable truth is that prolonged separation changes relationships, even loving ones. Memory fades. Emotional bonds weaken. The longer Timmy is kept from familiar people, the harder it becomes to restore those connections later. Reunification, if it ever happens, won't be a simple return. It will require rebuilding trust, comfort, and recognition. And rebuilding takes time, often more time than the system is willing to invest. There's also the question of motivation. When custody battles involve outside interests, intentions can blur. What begins as concern can evolve into control. What starts as advocacy can slide into ownership. And when a vulnerable person is at the center of that shift, the risk of exploitation grows. Timmy's future should never hinge on what he represents to others. It should hinge on what he needs to feel safe, stable, and respected. Yet too often, his needs are filtered through other people's goals. Whether those goals are emotional, financial, or ideological, the result is the same. Timmy becomes secondary to the narrative built around him. That's where the real danger lies, not in a single decision, but in a pattern of choices that slowly erode autonomy. Each decision justified, each step explained as necessary, until one day, the person at the center no longer recognizes the life being lived on their behalf. The aftermath of the custody battle isn't just about where Timmy sleeps or who signs paperwork. It's about whether his humanity is preserved in the process, whether he's treated as a person with emotional continuity or as a responsibility to manage. There's still time to course correct, but course correction requires humility. It requires admitting that removal alone doesn't solve complex problems. It requires acknowledging that harm can happen even when rules are followed. And it requires listening, not just to professionals, but to the quiet signals coming from Timmy himself. The path forward shouldn't be dictated by pride, fear, or control. It should be guided by consistency, compassion, and long-term thinking. Because what happens now will echo far beyond this moment. Children and vulnerable adults don't remember court dates. They remember how they felt when everything changed. And right now, the feeling left behind is uncertainty. If Timmy's story matters to you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments, thoughtfully and respectfully. As weeks turn into months, the impact of separation doesn't freeze in time. It evolves. What initially feels like shock slowly transforms into something harder to detect and harder to undo. This is the stage where damage, if it's happening, becomes quieter. And quiet harm is the kind most likely to be overlooked. For Timmy, the passage of time doesn't bring clarity. It brings distance. Distance from the people who knew how to interpret his moods. Distance from routines that gave him predictability. Distance from an environment where he didn't need to explain himself to feel understood. Each passing day subtly reshapes what feels normal and not always in a healthy way. One of the biggest misconceptions in custody aftermaths is the belief that adjustment equals improvement. Observers see compliance and assume progress. They see fewer outward reactions and assume stability. But for someone like Timmy, compliance may simply mean resignation. It may mean learning that resistance leads nowhere, so silence becomes the safest option. Silence, however, is not peace. When a person with limited power realizes that expressing discomfort doesn't change outcomes, they often internalize it. Over time, this internalization can lead to anxiety, confusion, or emotional numbness. And because these effects don't always manifest in disruptive ways, they're easy to miss, or worse, easy to dismiss. Another overlooked factor is how dependency is reshaped. In familiar environments, Timmy's dependencies were mutual and organic. He relied on others, but others also relied on him in small, meaningful ways: presence, companionship, shared routine. That mutuality matters. It reinforces dignity. In structured placements, dependency often becomes one-directional. Timmy becomes the recipient of care, not a participant in shared life. Decisions are made for him, schedules are imposed, and his role narrows to compliance. Even when basic needs are met, that loss of participation can erode self-worth. People underestimate how important contribution is to a sense of self. Being cared for is not the same as being valued. There's also the issue of emotional memory. Timmy may not articulate loss in conventional terms, but emotional memory doesn't require language. The body remembers absence. The nervous system remembers disruption, and those memories can surface later as fear, withdrawal, or confusion, often disconnected from the original cause in the eyes of professionals. This is why long-term outcomes matter more than immediate optics. A placement can look successful on paper while quietly failing the person inside it. Another concern is how narratives solidify over time. Once a custody decision is made, stories harden. One version becomes official. Alternatives are dismissed as misinformation or emotion, and anyone questioning the outcome risks being labeled disruptive rather than concerned. In that environment, advocating for Timmy's emotional needs becomes harder, not easier. The longer he remains out of sight, the less urgency people feel to ask how he's actually doing. Familiarity fades for the public, but for Timmy, the absence remains constant. There's also the danger of identity erosion. Timmy's sense of who he is was tied to people, places, and roles that gave him meaning. When those are removed without replacement, identity doesn't simply pause, it fragments. New labels take over. Case files replace relationships. Observations replace understanding. And once a person becomes a file rather than a face, it's easier to overlook their inner life. The path forward requires more than patience. It requires intention. Timmy doesn't just need time to adjust. He needs continuity. That means preserving connections where possible, honoring emotional history, and recognizing that removal from harm does not automatically equal placement into healing. Healing requires familiarity. Healing requires trust. Healing requires listening. Another uncomfortable truth is that systems are not designed for nuance. They operate on thresholds, checklists, and risk assessments. Timmy's well-being, however, exists in the space between those metrics. It shows up in subtle changes: sleep patterns, appetite, affect, engagement. Without advocates paying close attention, those signs can go unnoticed. And once unnoticed, they become normalized. There's still an opportunity to shift direction. That doesn't mean undoing every decision. It means refining them. It means asking better questions now, not just justifying past choices. It means acknowledging that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. Most importantly, it means centering Timmy again, not as a symbol, not as a case, not as a victory or a loss, but as a person whose future is still being written. The real measure of success won't be whether procedures were followed. It will be whether Timmy emerges from this experience with his sense of safety intact. Because custody battles end in courtrooms, but their consequences live on quietly long after the doors close. If you're still following Timmy's story, share your thoughts below, especially if you believe emotional well-being should matter just as much as legal outcomes. Time continues to move forward, whether healing keeps pace with it or not. By this stage, the custody battle itself has faded into the background for many observers, replaced by silence, assumptions, and a belief that things must be settled by now. But for Timmy, this is not the end of the story. This is the middle, the most fragile and least visible phase. This is where long-term consequences begin to take shape. When a person is removed from their familiar environment, the first phase is shock. The second is adjustment. But the third phase, the one most rarely acknowledged, is imprinting. This is the period when new experiences don't just happen. They begin to overwrite old reference points. What feels safe, what feels normal, and what feels expected all start to change. And that can go in two ways. If the new environment actively preserves emotional continuity by honoring relationships, routines, and personal identity, then adaptation can be healthy. But if continuity is ignored, minimized, or treated as inconvenient, then adaptation becomes survival rather than growth. Survival looks calm from the outside. Growth looks alive. One of the biggest risks in Timmy's situation is learned passivity. When someone realizes that their preferences, attachments, or protests no longer influence outcomes, they may stop expressing them altogether. This isn't cooperation, it's self-protection, and it's often mistaken for improvement. Professionals may see fewer behavioral incidents and mark progress. Caregivers may see compliance and assume comfort. But inside, a person may simply be shrinking to fit expectations. That shrinking is not harmless. Over time, learned passivity can turn into chronic anxiety, difficulty forming trust, or an inability to advocate for oneself. These effects don't always surface immediately. Sometimes they don't appear until years later, when the person is expected to make decisions, express needs, or navigate independence. By then, the roots are deep. Another critical issue is emotional substitution. When original bonds are severed or restricted, the human mind seeks replacement. This can manifest as overattachment to authority figures, fear of abandonment, or confusion about loyalty. Timmy may feel pressure, spoken or unspoken, to transfer trust quickly, even if that trust hasn't been earned. That pressure creates internal conflict. Loyalty to new caregivers can feel like betrayal of old ones. Missing familiar people can feel like disobedience. Grief can feel like misbehavior. Without safe space to process those emotions, they don't disappear, they go underground. There's also the question of narrative control. Who gets to define Timmy's story now? What version of events is reinforced around him? What explanations are offered for why his life changed so abruptly? If the story he hears excludes his lived experience, confusion grows. If the story minimizes loss, guilt grows. If the story frames separation as for his own good, without acknowledging pain, shame grows. Children and vulnerable adults internalize narratives quickly, especially when they lack power to challenge them. Another overlooked factor is sensory memory. Places hold meaning. Sounds, smells, textures, all anchor a sense of belonging. Removing someone from those anchors without transitional support can dysregulate the nervous system. This can show up as restlessness, sleep disturbances, or emotional flattening. Again, subtle. Again, easy to miss. The longer Timmy remains disconnected from his past environment, the harder reintegration becomes, even if reintegration is later deemed appropriate. Familiar faces start to feel distant. Routines feel foreign. Emotional muscle memory weakens. This is why delays matter. This is why access matters. This is why later is not neutral. At this stage, the responsibility shifts from justification to stewardship. Decisions have been made, but their implementation still matters. Oversight still matters. Willingness to adjust still matters. The question is no longer, was this necessary? The question is this humane? Humane care does not erase history. Humane care does not demand emotional amnesia. Humane care recognizes that protection without connection can still cause harm. There are ways forward that don't require choosing sides. They require choosing compassion. They require acknowledging complexity instead of simplifying it for comfort. Timmy's path forward should include consistent emotional check-ins, not just compliance checks. It should include preservation of identity, not just management of behavior. It should include advocacy that is persistent, not performative. Most of all, it should include listening, real listening, to what Timmy communicates, even when he doesn't use words. Because the most important signals are often the quietest ones. The aftermath of custody isn't measured in court dates or documents. It's measured in whether a person feels safe enough to be themselves again. That outcome is still undecided, and it depends on what happens next. If you believe long-term emotional impact deserves more attention in cases like this, share your thoughts in the comments below. By the time a custody case reaches this stage, the public usually moves on. Headlines fade. Comment sections quiet down. Attention shifts elsewhere. But the truth is, this is the moment that matters most. Not when the decision is made, but when its consequences begin to harden into daily reality. For Timmy, the future isn't shaped by what happened in courtrooms or meetings. It's shaped by what happens on ordinary days. Mornings, evenings, quiet moments when no one is watching. That's where outcomes are truly decided. The hardest part of situations like this is that damage doesn't always look like damage. There may be no visible bruises, no dramatic outbursts, no obvious red flags. Instead, the harm, if it exists, takes the form of subtle erosion. Confidence slowly thins. Curiosity dims. Expression narrows. The person becomes smaller, quieter, easier to manage. And that's where systems often fail. Systems are designed to handle extremes. They respond to crisis, not nuance. They intervene when there's chaos, not when there's silence. But silence can be the most dangerous condition of all, especially for someone who has learned that speaking up changes nothing. One of the most critical questions moving forward is whether Timmy is allowed to remain emotionally whole. That means being permitted to miss people, to talk about them without fear of consequences, to hold memories without being corrected, redirected, or discouraged. Grief that isn't acknowledged doesn't disappear. It reorganizes itself. It can turn inward, becoming self-blame. It can turn outward, becoming anxiety. Or it can shut down entirely, becoming numbness. None of those outcomes represent healing. Another issue that deserves serious attention is the difference between care and control. Care adapts to the individual. Control adapts the individual to the system. From the outside, both can look orderly, but internally, they feel very different. Care asks, what does this person need to feel safe? Control asks, what does this situation need to remain stable? Those are not the same question. If Timmy's environment prioritizes predictability over humanity, the cost will show up later. It may appear as difficulty trusting caregivers, difficulty forming healthy relationships, difficulty knowing where he belongs, or believing that he belongs anywhere at all. Belonging isn't granted by placement. It's built through continuity. Continuity of relationships, continuity of identity, continuity of emotional validation. Break those threads, and you don't just disrupt a living situation, you disrupt a sense of self. There's also the matter of voice. Who speaks for Timmy now? Who challenges assumptions on his behalf? Who asks hard questions when comfort and convenience begin to outweigh compassion? Advocacy cannot be conditional. It cannot exist only when cameras are on or when public pressure is high. True advocacy is often inconvenient. It insists on nuance when simple answers would be easier. It demands accountability when silence would be safer. Timmy deserves advocates who are willing to stay, not just arrive. Another overlooked factor is time distortion. For adults, Months can feel like administrative delays. For someone living inside uncertainty, those same months can feel endless. Each unanswered question becomes heavier. Each unanswered longing grows sharper. Time doesn't pause for emotional development. Every day, without clarity, teaches a lesson. Either it teaches that the world is reliable or that it isn't. Either it teaches that people return or that they vanish. Those lessons don't require words. They're learned through experience. If Timmy is told he is safe but feels abandoned, the feeling will win. If he is told he is cared for but feels unheard, the silence will speak louder. This is why transparency matters. Not legal transparency, emotional transparency. Honest explanations given at a level Timmy can understand. Space for questions without punishment. Permission to express confusion without being labeled difficult. Safety isn't just about protection from harm. It's about protection from erasure. There's also a broader responsibility here, one that extends beyond Timmy himself. His case reflects how society treats vulnerable people when systems collide with humanity. Whether we prioritize efficiency over empathy, whether we see individuals or cases, whether we believe that removing someone from harm automatically places them into healing. It doesn't. Healing requires intention. It requires listening. It requires patience. And it requires humility. The humility to admit when something isn't working and the courage to change course. No outcome should be considered final if it causes quiet suffering. The path forward for Timmy should not be defined by who won or lost. It should be defined by whether he feels grounded, respected, and emotionally intact. Whether he is allowed to grow without fear. Whether he can trust that the adults around him are there for him. Not for outcomes, not for control, not for appearances. Just for him. That future is still possible, but it depends on ongoing awareness, ongoing scrutiny, ongoing care that doesn't fade when attention does. The story doesn't end with custody. It begins there, and the real measure of success won't be written in documents or rulings. It will be written in Timmy's ability to feel safe being himself, now and years from now. That responsibility belongs to everyone involved. If you believe cases like this deserve continued attention beyond the courtroom, share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.